Chapter 34. The three pillars of the Christian faith: miracles, prophecies, and precepts. When Christians are asked for the proof of the divinity of Jesus Christ, they point to his miracles and precepts and the messianic prophecies said to have been fulfilled by his coming. And the same kind of evidence is adduced to prove the divine claims of their Bible and its religion, including the Old Testament, which contains the prophecies. Their divine origin and supernatural character are claimed to be proved by the miracles, prophecies, and precepts found recorded in the Holy Book. All then stand or fall together. The divinity of Christ and the divinity of the Bible and its religion all rest on this threefold argument. All it is claimed are attested and proved by a threefold display of divine power manifested. 1. By the performance of various acts transcending human power and the laws of nature, called miracles. 2. By the discernment of events lying in the future which no human sagacity or prescience could have foreseen, unless aided by omniscience, the display of such power being called prophecy. 3. By the enunciation of moral precepts beyond the mental capacity of human beings to originate. These three propositions cover the whole ground. They constitute the three grand pillars of the Christian faith, which, if shown to be untenable, must prostrate the whole superstructure to the ground. We will examine each separately, commencing with miracles. 1. Miracles, the first pillar of the Christian faith. We will not occupy space in discussing the various meanings assigned to the word miracle by different writers, but take the popular definition as given above and proceed to inquire how much evidence can be deduced from the miracles represented as having been performed by Jesus Christ toward proving his divinity and the truth of his religion. In the first place, it should be borne in mind that Christianity is not the only religion which appeals to miracles as proof of its divine authorship. More than 300 systems and sects are reported in history, most of which have, from time immemorial, gloried in being able to wield this knockdown argument as they claim it to be, in support of the truth and divine authenticity of their various systems of faith. We have briefly noticed some of the miraculous achievements reported in their sacred books and ascribed to their gods and sin-atoning saviors, and compare them with similar ones related to Jesus Christ, commencing with pagan miracles. As the whole pathway of religious history is thickly bestudded with miracles wrought in all ages and countries, and every page of the Oriental Bibles and religious books is literally loaded down with the relation of these marvelous prodigies, said to have been wrought by their gods, demigods, and crucified saviors, it places a writer in a quandary to know where to begin to make a selection. We will express no opinion here as to whether these astounding feats were ever witnessed or not, but will merely state that they come to us as well authenticated as those reported in the Christian Bible. There is as much evidence that Zoroaster, at the request of King Gustav, caused a tree to spring up in a man's yard forthwith, as much magnificent proportions that no rope could be found large enough to reach around it, as that Jesus Christ caused a fig tree to wither away by merely cursing it. And we have the same kind of evidence that the Hindu Messiah, Krishna of India, restored two boys to life who had been killed by the bites of serpents, as that Jesus Christ resurrected Lazarus and the widow's son of Nain, and seeing the devil perform some of the most difficult... And as much proof that Bacchus turned water into wine, as that Jesus performed this act 600 years after. 100 other similar comparisons might be drawn. The evidence of the truth of these performances in both cases, pagan and Christian, is simply the report of the writer. If there are any exceptions to be made in either case of better evidence, it will be found in favor of pagan religion, for its adherents are able, in many cases, to point to imperishable monuments of stone erected in commemoration of their miracles. And Mr. Goodrich tells us this is the highest species of evidence that can be offered to prove the truth of any ancient event. But as Christians, on the other hand, can find no such evidence to prove the performance of any miracles reported in their Bible, it will be seen at once that the pagan miracles are the best authenticated. The famous historian Pausanias states upon current authority that Asclepius raised several persons from the dead, and names Hippolytus among the number, and then points to a stone monument erected as a proof of the occurrence, thus furnishing, according to Christian logic, the most conclusive proof of one of the most astounding miracles ever wrought. And yet no philosopher or man of science in this age can credit the literal truth of the story. But a spiritualist can easily conceive that he and others might have mistaken the risen spirits of those resurrected persons for their physical bodies, because they know that many mistakes of this kind have occurred in modern times. We might refer to many other cases of pagan miracles attested by monumental evidence if our space would permit, such as the names of many persons engraven upon the walls of the temple of Serapis, miraculously carved by the god Asclepius. Strabo tells us the ancient temples are full of tablets describing miraculous cures performed by virgin-born gods of those times, and names a case of two blind men being restored to sight by the son of god Aclades in the presence of a large multitude of people, who acknowledged the miraculous power of the god with a loud acclaim. Many spiritualists at the present day know by practical experience how these miraculous cures were performed. Without continuing the citation of cases, suffice it to say the sin-atoning gods of the Orientals are reported as performing the same train of miracles assigned to Jesus Christ, such as performing astonishing cures, casting out devils, raising the dead, etc. Now, sadly warped indeed by education must be that mind which cannot see that if the account of such prodigies reported in the history of Jesus Christ can do anything towards proving him to have been a god, then the world must have been full of gods long before his time. It is impossible to dodge or evade such a conclusion. Christians are in the habit of assuming that all the miraculous reports in the Bible are unquestionably true, while those reported in pagan Bibles are mere fables and fiction. But if they will reverse this proposition, it will be easier support. It can be easier. Or reverse this proposition, it can be easier supported because we have shown their miracles are better attested and authenticated. Their own Bible admits that the heathen not only could and did perform miracles, but miraculous prodigies of the most astonishing character, equal to any reported in their own religious history, such as transmuting water into blood, sticks into serpents, and stones into frogs. In a word, it is admitted they performed all the miraculous feats of Moses with the single exception of turning dust into lice. But certainly, making lice was not a more difficult achievement than that of making frogs, and this is admitted they did do successfully. Hence, it will be seen that the Egyptian pagans made as great a display of divine or miraculous power as God's holy people, according to the admission of the Bible itself. And there is no intimation that the mode of performing the miracles was not the same in both cases, but a strong probability exists that it was, a conclusion confirmed by the Bible report of the case, which leads us to infer that they performed the miracles in the same way Moses did. For it is said, the Egyptians did so with their enchantments, that is, with the enchanting rod used on such occasions by Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and other nations, including also the Jews. Now, as Moses always used the enchanting rod in performing miracles, called by him the rod of God, the rod of divination, etc., there is thus furnished the most satisfactory proof that he performed his miracles on this occasion as well as all other occasions by the same stratagem as the Egyptians and other nations did. And even if the mode adopted by the Egyptians had been different, it is still admitted they performed the miracles. In the name of reason and common sense, then, we ask if such facts as here presented with the case just referred to do not forever prostrate and annihilate all arguments based on miracles toward proving the divine character or divine origin of the religion of the Bible, or towards proving Jesus Christ or any other being reported to have performed miracles as possessing divine attributes. Catholic miracles. Some of the most astonishing and best authenticated miracles ever performed by any religious sect we find reported in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, looked upon and styled by the Protestants the mother of harlots and abomination. And yet there is much stronger proof that the Catholic religion has the divine sanction if miracles can furnish such proof. The editor of the official memoirs declares that during the Italian War of 1797, several pictures of the Virgin Mary, situated in different parts of the country, were seen to open and shut their eyes for the space of 6 or 7 months, and that no less than 60,000 people actually saw this miracle performed, including many bishops, deacons, cardinals, and other officers of the church, whose names are given. In Forsyth's Italy, page 344, written by a highly accredited author, tells us that a withered elm tree was suddenly restored to full life and vigor by coming in contact with the body of Saint Zenobus, and that this miracle took place in the most public part of town in the presence of many thousands of people. That it is recorded by contemporary historians and inscribed upon a marble column now standing where the tree stood. Now, the question may be asked here, would the people have allowed such an impudent trick to insult them as the erection of a monument for an event that never took place? If not, how is the matter to be explained? These are only specimens of 100 more Catholic miracles of an astounding character at our command. Several inquiries may be entertained in the solution of these stories. First, were some phenomenon really witnessed on which these stories were constructed, but which got magnified from a molehill to a mountain before they found their way into history? Or, second, were they manufactured as a pious fraud, which was rather a fashionable business with the early disciples of the Christian faith, according to Mr. Moshim? Whatever answer may be given to these questions will explain the miracles of the Christian Bible, excepting those which can be accounted for on natural principles. Satanic miracles. Among all the workers of miracles reported in the Bible, the devil seems to have been preeminent, and hence must come in for the better end of the argument towards proving him to have been a god. No miracles could excel the act of his transforming himself into an angel of light, as stated in 2 Corinthians 9:11-14. It is not transcended by any other case, not even by Christ's transfiguration. And according to Paul, he was endowed with all power and signs and lying wonders. If, then, he possessed all power, Christ and no other God could have possessed a miraculous power superior to his, for all comprehends the whole, beyond which nothing can reach. Where, then, is the evidence to come from to prove that Christ was a God? Because he was a miracle worker, or his religion divine, because attested by miracles, seeing the devil perform some of the most difficult miracles ever wrought. Should we not then change his title from that of a daemon to a god, and place his religion amongst the divinely endowed systems. St. John represents the evil one as having power to make fire come down from heaven in the sight of men, and to deceive those that dwell on the earth by means of those miracles which he hath power to do. Here the question arises, what can a miracle prove? What end can it serve? And what good can possibly arise from the display of the miracle-working power when it is liable to deceive those that dwell upon the earth? Certainly, therefore, it proves nothing and accomplishes nothing. And may not the apostles themselves have been deceived in ascribing some of the miracles they record to Jesus instead of the devil? Certainly, we are drifted upon the quicksands of uncertainty by such a display of the miracle-working power, and are obnoxious to most fatal deception, which proves the total inutility and futility of such prodigies. Christ's miracles, not his own, but wrought through him and not by him. How could Christ's miracles, assuming they were wrought, do anything towards proving his divinity when he did not claim to be their author, but merely the agent or instrument in the hands of the Father, like the apostles, who are reported to have performed the same miracles? The Father, he doth the work, is his own declaration, and the apostles seem to have accepted his word and his view of the matter. For proof, listen to Peter. Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did by him in the midst of you, as ye yourselves do now. Acts 2:22. Let it be noted then, that Christ's miracles were not performed by him as a God, but as a man approved by God. He was the mere medium or instrument in the case, a fact which banishes at once all grounds for controversy relative to his miracles serving the purpose of attesting his divinity, especially when it is conceded that men, magicians, and devils could achieve the same feats. Christ's miracles did not convince the people. As the miracles of Christ seem to have had little effect towards convincing the people of his claims to the Godhead, it is evident they could have been but little superior to those performed by others, and therefore not designed, at least not calculated, to convince them that he was a God. The frequent instances in which he upbraids the people for their unbelief and calls them fools, slow of heart, etc., is a proof of this statement. Christ's miracles not designed to convince the people. A circumstance involving pretty strong proof that Christ's miraculous achievements were not considered as evidence of his divinity is the fact that they were frequently performed in private, sometimes in the night and often under the injunction of secrecy. See thou tell no man was the injunction after the feat was performed, perhaps in a private room. How can such facts be reconciled with the assumption that his miracles were designed to convince the people of his claims to the divine entity, as Christians frequently assert, when the people were not allowed to witness them, nor his disciples even to report them? Who can believe that he was a divine being or Messiah when he charged his disciples to tell no man that he was such a being? Such incongruities, verge to a contradiction. It is a logical contradiction to say that private miracles were designed to dissolve public skepticism, and yet many, if not most, of his reputed miraculous achievements were of this character. When he cured a blind man, he not only led him out of the town, Mark 13:23 or 7:23, but forbid him. When his sight was restored, returning to the city, he feared he would publish it. When he resurrected Lazarus, he did not call the whole country around to witness it, but performed the act before a private party. The reanimation of Jairus' daughter was in the same concealed manner, in a private room where nobody was admitted but his 3 confidential disciples, Peter, James, and John, and the parents, none of whom make any report of the case. How, therefore, the reporter, Mark, found it out, when he was not present, and none of the party were allowed to tell it to anybody, or why he should betray his trust by publishing it, if he was informed of it, is a mystery of godliness not easily divined. When Christ cleansed the leper, he sent him to the priest, enjoining him to say nothing to any man. The dumb, when restored to speech, was not allowed to exhibit any practical proof of the fact by using his tongue. His miraculous preambulation on the surface of the sea, walking on the water, was not only alone, but in the dark. His transfiguration, likewise, according to Dr. Barnes, took place in the night, his 3 favorite companions being the only witnesses, and they heavy with sleep. And finally, the crowning miracle of all, the resurrection, is not only represented as taking place in the night, but without a substantial or terrestrial witness to report it. Verily, such facts as these are not calculated to augment the faith. Junior work, the conviction of a skeptic that these miracles were ever performed, seeing so few are reported as witnessing them, and even their testimony is not given. We have not the testimony of one person who claims to have been present and seen these wonders performed. Such facts are calculated to cast distrust upon the whole matter, especially when taken in connection with the fact that 9/10 of his life form a perfect blank in history. Is it not possible, we ask, to reconcile such a fact with the belief of his divinity? Is it possible a God would lead a private life or live 27 years on earth and do nothing worthy of note? A God known to nobody and noticed by nobody. Most transcendingly absurd is such a thought. Had Christ possessed the character that is claimed for him, not an hour of his life could have passed unaccompanied by some remarkable incident that would have been heralded abroad and its record indelibly engraven upon the page of history. But instead of this, his acts were too commonplace to be noticed. All history ignores him. The fact that no history, sacred or profane, that not one of the 300 histories of that age makes the slightest allusion to Christ or any of the miraculous incidents engrafted into his life certainly proves, with a coggency that no logic can overthrow, no sophistry can contradict, and no honest skepticism can resist, that there never was such a miraculously endowed being as his many orthodox disciples claim him to have been. The fact that Christ finds no place in the history of the era in which he lived, that not one event of his real life is recorded by anybody but his own interested and prejudiced biographers, settles the conclusion, beyond cavil or criticism, that the godlike achievements ascribed to him are naught but fable or fiction. It not only proves that he was not miraculously endowed, but proves he was not even naturally endowed to such an extraordinary degree as to make him an object of general attention. It would be a historical anomaly without a precedent that Christ should have performed any of the extraordinary acts attributed to him in the Gospels, and no Roman or Grecian historian, and neither Philo nor Josephus, both writing in that age, and both living almost on the spot where they are said to have been witnessed, and both recording minutely all the religious events of that age and country, make the slightest mention of one of them, nor the reputed authors. Such a historical fact banishes the last shadow of faith in their reality. It is true, a few lines are found in one of Josephus's large works alluding to Christ, but it is so manifestly a forgery that we believe all modern critics of any note, even of the Orthodox school, reject it as a base interpolation. Even Dr. Lardner, one of the ablest defenders of the Christian faith that ever wielded a pen in its support, and who has written 10 large volumes to bolster it up, assigns 9 cognate reasons, which we would insert here if we had space, for the conclusion that Josephus could not have penned those few lines found in his Jewish Antiquities referring to Christ. Jew could possibly use such language. It would be a glaring absurdity to suppose a leading Jew could call Jesus the Christ when the whole Jewish nation have ever contested the claim that the sternest logic and fought it to the bitter end. It ought, therefore, says Dr. Lardner, for the 9 reasons which he assigns, to be forever discarded from any place among the evidences of Christianity. Life of Lardner by Dr. Kippis, page 23. As the passage is not found in any edition of Josephus prior to the era of Eusebius, the suspicion has fastened upon that Christian writer as being its author, who argued that falsehood might be used as a medicine for the benefit of the churches. See his ECCLES history. I don't even know what that is. History. Origen, who lived before Eusebius, admitted Josephus makes no allusion to Christ. Of course, the passage was not then in Josephus. 1 or 2 other similar passages have been found in other authors of that era, which it is not necessary to notice here, as they are rejected by Christian writers. It must be conceded, therefore, that the numerous histories covering the epoch of the birth of Christ chronicle none of the astonishing feats incorporated in his gospel biographies as signalizing his earthly career, and make no mention of the reputed hero of these achievements, either by name or character. The conclusion is thusly irresistibly forced upon us, not only that he was not a miracle worker, but that he must have led rather an obscure life, entirely incompatible with his being a God or a Messiah who came to draw all men unto him. And it should also be noted here that none of Christ's famous biographers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, are honored with a notice in history till 190 years after the birth of Christ. And then the notice was by a Christian writer, Irenaeus. We look in vain, says a writer, for any contemporary notice of the Gospels, or Christ the subject of the Gospels, outside of the New Testament. So little was the King of Jews known that the Romans were compelled to pay one of his apostles to turn traitor and act as a guide before they could find him. It is impossible to observe this negative testimony of all history against Christ and his miracles and not be struck with amazement and seized with the conviction that he was not a god and not a very extraordinary man. Who can believe that a God from off the throne of heaven could make his appearance on earth, and while performing the most astounding miracles ever recorded in any history, or that ever excited the credulity of any people, and be finally publicly crucified in the vicinity of a great city, and yet all the histories written in those times, both sacred and profane, pass over with entire silence the slightest notice of any of these extraordinary events. Impossible, most self-evidently impossible. And when we find that this omission was so absolute that no record was made of the day or year of his birth by any person in the era in which he lived, and that they were finally forgotten, and hence that there are, as a writer informs us, no less than 133 different opinions about the matter, the question assumes a still more serious aspect. From the logical potency of these facts, we are driven to the conclusion that Christ received but little attention outside of the circle of his own credulous and interested followers, and consequently stands on a level with Krishna of India, Mithra of Persia, Osiris of Egypt, and other demigods of antiquity, all whose miraculous legends were engrafted in their histories long after their death. This leads us to consider how Christ's incredible legend got into his history. There is a remarkably easy and satisfactory way of accounting for all the marvelous feats and incredible stories found in the gospel narratives of Jesus Christ without assuming their reality or any intentional fraud or falsehood by the writers. When we learn that none of his evangelical biographies were penned, as Dr. Lardner affirms, till long after his death, We are no longer puzzled for a moment to understand exactly how many statements wholly incredible and morally impossible crept into his history, without challenging or calling in question the veracity or honesty of the writer. Perhaps the most powerful cord of moral conviction which holds the Christian professor to a belief in the divinity of Jesus Christ is the difficulty of bringing himself to believe that the numerous miracles ascribed to him in the Gospels are merely the work of fiction, fabricated without a basis of truth, when they were evidently penned by men of the deepest piety and the strictest moral integrity. We ourselves were once environed with this difficulty, but it stands in our way no longer. We are disenthralled. We have solved the problem. We have found the true explanation. The key and clue to the whole secret is found in the simple fact, admitted by Christian writers and evidenced by the Bible itself, that no history of Christ's practical life was ever written out by a person claiming to have been an eyewitness of the events reported, nor until every incident and act of the noble-minded Nazarene had ample time to become enormously magnified and distorted by rumor, fable, and fiction, so that it was impossible to discriminate or separate the real from the unreal, the true from the false, in his partially forgotten life. It could not be done. A true history could not then be, nor have been written under such circumstances. It is manifestly impossible. The time for writing each gospel is fixed to Dr. Lardner as following: Matthew 62 AD, Mark 64 AD, Luke 63 or 64 AD, and John 68 AD, thus allowing ample time for every noteworthy incident of his life to grow from molehills to mountains and to swell into fiction, fable, and prodigy, a tendency to which was then very rife and very prevalent in all religious countries. Having made a note of this fact, let the reader treasure in memory, as another equally important fact, that the biography of no man of note who figured in that era or who lived prior to the dawn of letters, if penned many years after his death, as was frequently the case, is free from a large percentage of extravagant detail and simple incidents magnified into miracles. This was the uncurbed tendency of the age which illuminated into universal custom. The simplest incident in every man's life who exhibited mind enough to attract attention by rolling from year to year and passing from mouth to mouth invariably got to be finally swelled into such undue and enormous proportions that it could only be accounted for by assuming the actor to have been a god. In this way, many men of different countries who had made a mark in the world received divine honors and divine attributes, including such characters as Krishna of India, Mithra of Persia, Quirinius of Rome, Eris of the Druids, Quetzalcoatl of Mexico, Jesus Christ of Judea, and many others who might be mentioned. This circumstance deified them. The evidence of history to prove this declaration is abundant and irresistible. Posthumous histories alone deified men. To the two important facts above cited, that Jesus Christ's evangelical histories were all written long after his death, and that unwritten histories of great men always become swollen and distorted with the lapse of time, let the reader add the equally significant fact that there is in all cases a vast difference in the biographies of famous men penned during their actual lives or immediately subsequent to their death, while every act and incident of their character was fresh and vigorous in the minds and memories of the contemporaneous people, and before the ball of exaggerated rumor was set rolling, compared with those written at a later date, after molehills of fact had become mountains of fiction. The former are natural and reasonable, the later unnatural and extravagant and often fabulous. We will cite a few cases in proof. Let the reader compare the biographical sketches of Alexander the Great, written near the epoch of his practical life and those composed since the dawn of the Christian era. And he will find that the posthumous notices of him alone contain the story of the sun becoming obscured and the earth developed into darkness at the time of his mortal exit. It will be found also that Virgil's account of the sheeted dead rising from their graves at the time of Caesar's death, and which was written long after that famous hero left the stage of action, is omitted in all the contemporary notices of that monarch, having crept in subsequently. In like manner, the various miracles recorded of Pythagoras by his biographer Jamblichus, such as his walking on the air, stilling the tempest, raising the dead, etc., are not related of him by any contemporaneous writers who lived in the era of his practical life. And let the reader compare also Damas' Life of Apollonius with that of his later biography by Philostratus as an illustration of the same historical fact. Mohammed and his biographers might be included in the same category. It is a remarkable circumstance that neither Mohammed himself nor any of his immediate followers claim for him more than a humble title of prophet or God's holy prophet, while his later admirers and devout disciples have elevated him to the throne of heaven and given him a seat among the gods. And this historical analysis might be extended much further than if necessary, but cases enough have been cited to prove the principle and establish the proposition. And what is the lesson taught by these facts? A deeply instructive and all-important one. From the foregoing historical illustrations, we are impelled to the important conclusion that the tissue of extravagant and incredible stories of demigod performances, which run as a vein of fiction through the gospel narrations of Jesus Christ, all grow out of a long-continued rumor in an age when the imagination was untamed and unbounded, and credulity uncurbed by a practical knowledge of the principles of science, and consequently the pen of the historian had lawless scope. All difficulty then vanishes, and the question is put forever at rest by assuming that if the gospel histories of Jesus had been written by men who claimed to record only what they saw and heard themselves, we should have a more credible and instructive history of the great Judean reformer, freed from those Munchausen prodigies and that wild romance which mar the beauty and credibility of those now in popular use. This conclusion is not only natural, but irresistible to a mind untrampled by education and unbefogged by priestcraft. All that is wanting to convince us that miracles constitute no part of the real history of Christ is a new contemporary instead of a posthumous biography. A history written in the age which knew him and by an unprejudiced writer who witnessed all his movements. And we are perfectly willing to risk our reputation in this life and our salvation in the next by stating our conviction that this will be the unanimous verdict of posterity before 50 generations pass away. Christ's miracles reconstructed from former miracles. There are other circumstances than those noticed in the preceding chapter which can aid us very materially in solving the problem of Christ's divinity, or in other words, can aid us in tracing his miracles to their origin, and thus confirm the truth of the preceding proposition. Moses and the prophets were considered by the evangelists antitypes of archetypes of the coming Savior. Hence, some of the more important incidents of their lives were hunted up and worked over again to make them fit the life of Christ as the Messiah, reconstructed and applied to him as the second Moses and a new prophet. For Moses is represented as saying, "A prophet shall the Lord your God raise up like unto me." Hence Moses comes in with the prophets as an antitype of Christ. The transfiguration of Christ is therefore constituted after the model of the transfiguration of Moses on Mount Sinai, and Christ is represented as raising the dead, not only because Elijah and Elisha had performed such miracles, but did it under circumstances which prove, as they suppose, he possessed superior power. For while they could only reanimate the body immediately after the breath had left it, Christ could raise a man after he had been dead 4 days, the case of Lazarus. Hence the new prophet was superior to the old and more like a god, the thing they desired to prove. Both Elijah and Christ are represented as raising a widow's son, Elijah being considered the special prototype of Christ, who many believed had reappeared under the changed name Elias. See John 5:17. And then we observe that while Elisha exhausted his skill in making 3 gallons of oil, Christ could make 30 gallons of wine, another proof of superiority of the new prophet. Then again, the miracle of feeding 100 men with 20 loaves is far excelled by the latter, who feeds 5,000 men with 5 loaves. And both prophets, Elijah and Christ, encountered unfordable streams in their travels. The expedient of the former is to make a passage, but Christ performed the greater miracle of walking on the surface. And while Moses had to send the leper without the camp before he could heal him, Christ could heal him instantly with a single touch. The same slaughter of the infants is commanded by Herod in order to destroy Christ that Pharaoh had ordered to effect the destruction of Moses, and thus many of the miracles of Jesus can be accounted for as reconstructions of former miracles. It was simply a competition or rivalry between the new messianic prophet and the old prophets. The new prophet excels and comes off victorious in every case and is thus considered to be a god. The object of the competition is to show that while the prophets, assisted by God, could perform marvelous deeds, Christ, being God himself, could perform greater. This was to be the proof of his being a god, that he could outvie the servants of God in every miraculous thing ascribed to them. This was one way adopted to prove his divinity. Christ's miracles manufactured from prophecies. Several of Christ's miracles seem to have grown out of the messianic prophecies, that is, were manufactured in order to fulfill the prophecies. There was, as we learn by the Gospels, an impression deep and wide spread among the disciples of Christ that the Old Testament was full of text foretelling the advent of their Messiah and foreshadowing his practical life. Under this conviction, a number of passages are quoted in the Gospels from the prophets as referring to Christ, but which, however, the context shows could not possibly have been written with any such thought or intention. Matthew has 5 miracles appertaining to Christ, built on prophecies in his first 2 chapters, and they are represented as taking place in order that the prophecy might be fulfilled. That is, Matthew, writing 64 years after Christ's advent, assumes those miracles had taken place because the prophecy required their performance, and hence recorded it as fact without knowing it to be such. A great deal of that kind of license was assumed in that and subsequent ages, as the facts of history are ample to prove. It was done under the religious conviction that the cause of God and the church required it to be done, and that therefore it was justified.